So, what happens if Russia wins this little global proxy war in Ukraine? A question I've been asking myself quite a bit here lately. Because obviously, NATO, which, ergo the United States of America, our goal is to bleed Russia dry in Ukraine by sending as many munitions and systems as possible to the Ukrainians so that the war stops in Ukraine and does not spill over into Eastern Europe proper, where there's a whole bunch more NATO allies. You know, the Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, the Akias, right? And then Poland, and then Finland. The Finns and the Russians do not like each other. Dare I say, in many cases, they hate each other, especially on the Finnish side. You know, they're not fans. Millions have been killed on both sides of the conflict between the Russians and the Finns. And so the strategy has been, thus far, love it or hate it, to equip the Ukrainians with as much equipment as possible and systems as possible so that the Russians are bled on Ukrainian soil, rather than elsewhere. The issue with that is that historically, generally speaking, the Russians don't do well in their first year of armed conflict. But usually by year 2, they get their poop in a group and they start kicking a bunch of tail. Got a couple of amens from the sheep. Well, we are entering into year 2 of this conflict in Ukraine. It's estimated that Russia will be mobilizing another 300 to 500,000 troops. And yes, the Ukrainians have captured a bunch of equipment with their offensive on Kherson, taking it back from the Russians, as well as all the systems that have been deployed by NATO allies. There's talk of F-16s, I believe it is, going over to Ukraine, and then you've got HIMARS, and you've got Patriot missile systems, and possibly some German tanks going as well. What are those? The Leopard? The German Leopard tanks? Something to that effect. Stand by. Electric fence was touching the water bin, and it's just hearing this incessant click, 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 click. Not good. It's been rectified. So, there's a possibility, always has been a possibility, that the Russians beat the ever-loving tar out of the Ukrainians. And Ukrainian casualties, civilian casualties, are estimated to be somewhere around 500,000 thus far. Probably not going to get better anytime soon. Whereas the Russians, and it's hard to get data out of that area, like real data, estimated the Russians are somewhere between 50 and 100,000 troops. And I realize there's probably some people furiously typing in the comments right now, Bear, you're wrong because I saw this thing on social media, whatever. None of us really know, because none of us have really been there, except for a small handful of us. And even then, those people have seen their little itty-bitty purview of the war in Ukraine, not the big overarching strategic image. So, what happens if Russia wins? Well, there's military implications, economic implications, agricultural implications, and industrial implications. I think economically, let's say Russia takes Ukraine. That's going to reinforce the legitimacy of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now Saudi Arabia, and a number of other nations. And so there's an increasing polarization on the global political and economic stage. The United States was the de facto world order for a hot minute, basically since World War II. We won the war in World War II. We established the rules that everybody played by or attempted to play by. And when people, and this is gross generalizations, and when people didn't play by those rules, we mobilized our military. We went across an ocean, pick an ocean. We kicked a bunch of ass, asterisk. And then we more or less returned home. We restored order, right? Nation building, Halliburton, blah, 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 blah. Okay. And here in the United States of America, we had cheap energy, cheap goods, relatively cheap labor. Well, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet nation, the Soviets, they fell apart. Or did they, Bear? Yes, I'm familiar with those tinfoil hat conspiracies. which I don't think have been proven out based upon this most recent military action in Ukraine by the Russians, but I digress. So now we have Russia reemerging on the world stage with Putin basically saying everything he's trying to do is to essentially reestablish the Soviet Union, that block of nations who are in allegiance so they can exert power and influence. Okay, dipolar world. Dare I say bipolar world. So economically, Russia is possibly going to strengthen. If they win in Ukraine, they will strengthen. So what does that do for us? It continues to weaken the US dollar, which is already in a downward spiral thanks to inflation. Yay! So I would expect if Russia continues to perform, increases their performance in Ukraine, and they actually win, air quote, win, whatever that looks like, which I would submit as taking control of Ukraine, like owning the landmass, then economically speaking, the United States of America is going to be in more of a world of hurt than it currently is, because the US dollar will continue to weaken comparatively to this block of nations that is BRICS. So, what about agriculturally? So, Russia and Ukraine produce a lot of wheat, a lot of corn, a lot of other agricultural exports. If Russia wins, Russia is going to basically onboard all of that Ukrainian infrastructure. Now, there's been a very interesting tactic by the Russians thus far in the war in Ukraine, which is intentionally targeting agricultural production capability. Farms, tractors, silos, etc., to reduce the capacity for the Ukrainians to be able to feed themselves. And the reasoning there, the idea there, is by attacking critical infrastructure like agriculture, you separate the population into two categories. Civilians who will flee so that they don't get ground to dust by the Red Army, and or people who are going to stay and therefore de facto become combatants, right? So it allows the Russians, at least in their mind, to separate out, if you're still here, you're a bad guy and we can kill you. So, is there a prepper lesson in there? Absolutely. Don't be where the problem is. But agriculturally, getting back to BRICS, what agricultural output there is from that region, Russia, Ukraine, etc., Belarus, very likely, Georgia, etc., that's not going to be available to the United States of America and its allies. That output is going to be available to China, Russia, India, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, and others who are part of the BRICS system that is rapidly emerging and gaining strength. That's going to exacerbate issues here at home. It'll drive food prices up because there will be continued scarcity of things on the global stage as far as availability of agricultural commodities. It's also possible to foment revolution and uprising in places like Africa, which are highly dependent upon food being imported into the continent so that people don't, skinnies with AKs don't revolt. Black Hawk down, anyone? All of these are potentials, by the way. We don't know. I'm just spitballing here off the top of my brain. No notes, no nothing. Militarily, if Russia wins in Ukraine, they take Ukraine, that puts them on the doorsteps of Eastern Europe and these NATO allies. So that increases the likelihood of hot Generation 3 conflict between Russia and NATO. The prevailing thought is that NATO can take Russia no problem. The issue with that is that if Russia can be defeated easily by NATO, that they would have no reason not to hit the big red button and put warheads on everybody's foreheads. It also empowers could also empower their ally, China, for military action in Taiwan and elsewhere, frankly. China is the world's #1 importer of food inputs like, fertilizer, #1 world importer of energy, oil, gas, etc., and #1 importer of food itself. Well, Russia, generally speaking, is a net exporter of all of those things. They're like the world's largest producer of fertilizer, So they'll probably end up selling that to China. Same thing with India, right? India has an interesting relationship with Russia and China. The Indians and the Chinese don't necessarily get along. They share a border that has been in conflict for a hot minute. But economically, they can read the writing on the wall, and you can see that regionally, nations are starting to pack up, tribe up, if you will, regionally. Russia, India, China, all in the same region of the world. It's probably better for India to hitch their wagon to Russia and China than to the United States, because we are way far away as compared to Russia and China. But all those agricultural exports, the fertilizer and the food from Russia, likely to go to India and China, which serves to strengthen them. And an army marches on their what? Their stomach, right? So a win for Russia in Ukraine could very likely embolden Chinese aggression towards Taiwan, right? Especially if you think about the loss of face for the United States, aka NATO, in Ukraine, while we're also over here, the United States is also over here saying, hey China, you better don't invade Taiwan. If you do, we're gonna schwack your pee-pee. And they're like, yeah, well, how'd that work for you in Ukraine? Not so good, huh? And of course, the argument could be made that we did not deploy the full military might of the United States armed forces in Ukraine, which is why the Ukrainians lost to Russia, saying that they did, right? Thinking into the future here. Reasonable argument. Although we've had advisors on the ground in Ukraine for a decade. So sounds a lot like the spin up to the Vietnam War, where we had advisors in Vietnam for a hot minute before we had an actual military deployment there. And anecdotally, I'm just waiting for the Black Swan event that gets the United States of America directly involved in Ukraine. A fight for our existence, existential battle between the West and the East, blah, 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 blah. We must act. Yeah, we'll see, won't we? I pray that this video does not become prophetic. So from a military standpoint, if Russia wins in Ukraine, not only does it put them on the doorstep of NATO, which leads to a very high likelihood of further conflict, probably large-scale Generation 3 warfare, exacerbated by Generation 4 warfare, terrorism with uprisings in places like Africa and other places, attacks on infrastructure, asymmetric warfare, etc., which then gets into 5th-gen warfare, which is what we're going to continue to see, what we're already seeing, which is cyber attacks and attacks on infrastructure like the grid, the banking system, hospital systems, billing systems, etc. All highly likely. And I know, super encouraging, right? So we've got economic, military, agricultural, politically. If you are the party that allowed Russia to win in Ukraine, the likelihood of your party getting reelected in the next election cycle is going to be low. It's my guess. And like I said, with the strengthening of BRICS, that's definitely a political issue because, what's that quote? War is politics by another means, something to that effect. So, likely to be continued division in the United States of America politically, exacerbated by a Russian win in Ukraine, which of course continues to lead to flare-ups of civil unrest, flare-ups of tyranny in the United States of America, etc., etc. Who knows, maybe there's continued bans and sanctions on Russian and Chinese materiel, including ammunition, firearms, your other Second Amendment type products, raw goods, commodities. Baltic birch, anybody? Can't buy Baltic birch plywood right now because it comes from Russia, even though it's really good plywood for making cabinets with. You know what I mean? Things like that. Russian steel. The United States doesn't produce a lot of its own steel. We import other people's steel, and then we make it pretty, and then we build stuff out of it. Also, Japan. The relationship between the United States and Japan is really important going forward from a military aspect as well as a political and economic aspect, because we need Japan as a jumping off point for any island hopping action in the Pacific, should China feel froggy and then they go after Taiwan. And because the fear with Taiwan is not just that they're going to take Taiwan, is that they're emboldened by that action to take Taiwan, and then they continue their aggression in the South China Sea. They're already building islands. They're already claiming other countries as their own. You've got such nations as New Zealand, Australia, Philippines, etc. in those regions, who are no fans of Chinese aggression, but also don't necessarily have the chutzpah to stand up to China on their own. So, just global conflict. That's all. Just, World War III. I don't know what's going to happen here. My hope is that the Russians are defeated summarily in Ukraine, but not so embarrassed in the doing of that they're like, screw it, hit the big red button. If we're going out, we're taking everybody with us, right? They're wearing a global suicide vest, if you will. Hope that doesn't happen. I hope that the Allies win, even though I am not a supporter of military action in Ukraine. Not because I have anything against the Ukrainian people. I think they very unfortunately have become the chessboard that the current global conflict is being played on. But I don't like our taxpayers or tax dollars being sent over there. Sooner or later, it's going to come to the point where we send American men and women over there to bleed and die for a cause that isn't necessarily ours. Sound familiar? And I'm not in support of that either. But here we are. The reality is it's already begun. We're a year into this thing. So if we're there, might as well win, right? And if we can win, and that keeps Russia from further aggression, which could have all of the impacts that I just discussed, good. Don't love it. Don't like the fact that we're there in the first place, but hell, let's at least win this thing if we're here. Because if we don't, things are likely to get more bleak. And the thought is that Vladimir Putin is on short time, that he's not well. And old men with a history of violence and got cut off there. As I was saying, old men with a history of violence and a fairly large ego are, generally speaking, unpredictable and aggressive when it comes to accomplishing their goals. And Russia has no love for the West. I gotta be honest, I don't have a whole lot of love for Russia. I was an 80s baby. G.I. Joe, Rambo, Rocky IV, right? I've been indoctrinated quite well. I don't have a whole lot of love for the Russians either, right? Wolverines! But I digress. So I don't know what the future holds. I'm not a prophet. But those are some possibilities that I see manifesting themselves if Russia does take all of Ukraine, if Russia does win the Ukraine war. And I guess lastly, from a military standpoint, think about this. We are sending a lot of munitions and systems over to Ukraine, and our replenishment is less than stellar, our replenishment capacity. So if we do get into a global conflict, what do we have left to fight the war with? Oh, we're sending them our old stuff. Yeah, Russia's using artillery shells from the 70s and 80s right now because they ran through all their new stuff. What do you think is going to happen to us if we get into a global conflict? Right? At some point, you need the old stuff. There's a reason we keep the old stuff lying around. So, I'm interested in your comments. I'd like to know what particularly you think, and please discuss it in a civil manner. There's no need to name call, there's no need to yell or all caps or exclamation points. The people in the comments above and below you, that's your brother or sister, treat them as such. I appreciate y'all. Have a blessed day. Shalom.